This tutorial will show you how to draw a weaving pattern and how to shade and blend with colored pencils to make it look super realistic. This is really great for practicing shading, making things look 3D, and also the weaving pattern is kind of like a checkerboard with a little bit more of a puzzle to it. If you love learning about art, hit that subscribe button to support my channel. Start with a piece of paper and a pencil with an eraser. And what's not seen in this video is how many times I tried to start this and I got so confused with my weaving. So here's what worked for me. Instead of just drawing lines, I'm drawing a shape. So think of this as a ribbon, a piece of fabric, or one of those lawn chairs that has a weaving pattern in the back. So instead of just lines, my brain worked better drawing the whole shape, and I didn't go off the page. You can go off the page, but that kind of confused me. And I want mine to look kind of organic, like it's a loose weave with thick fabric. So now I'm gonna draw a line or a shape, long rectangle underneath the first lines that I did. So I started vertical and now I'm doing horizontal lines behind it. You can start vertical or horizontal. Now before moving on to the next line, I'm thinking under, over, under. So if you're weaving, you're always thinking over, under, as you draw or as you're actually doing your weaving. So I want my first lines to be over, and now for this one, I'm gonna start by just drawing the shape underneath. And this really was tricky for my brain. So it's all under, and now I'm gonna erase the line here to appear like this part of the fabric is over the first one I drew. The middle part will be under, and then the next is gonna go over that last vertical line that I drew. I had to really think about that for a minute. So definitely look at images of what weaving looks like. It's one thing to do it with your hands. It's another to do it with your brain. And I have to say I did this multiple times before I was happy with it. If I just drew lines like a checkerboard, I had such a hard time saying, okay, wait, what's actually the ribbon or the fabric? And then what's the negative space or the background? If this is the first time you're doing this, I highly recommend starting with just 3 lines per direction. So 3 horizontal, 3 vertical with a pretty big space in between. If you're advanced and you've done patterns like this a lot, feel free to make your shapes smaller, feel free to make them closer together and do tons of overlapping. I'm offering the option here of going off the page. So that's what it would look like if you wanted to go off your page. But for me, I want to see the whole weaving from start to finish. Now it's time for color scheme, and I'm going to be starting out with red. So I'm going to start just by shading. Shading is using an art material, and for us today it's colored pencils, to create areas of light, medium, and dark values to create the illusion of 3 dimensions or depth. If you've never tried shading before, I highly recommend practicing with a value scale. A value scale is where you practice doing dark, medium, and light values to create that dark to light progression. So shading is a foundational skill, and so practice always makes better. So to create the weaving illusion, putting the dark area where the shadow would be of the overlapping ribbon or fabric is going to be key to make it look like it's going under, and then you want it lightest at the top. So you can see I'm doing darkest on the sides or the end of this area, and then in the center that would be raised a little bit because it's crossing over another piece of fabric, and so that area needs to be lighter so it looks like it's raised up a little bit. So the foundations here is just looking at images of weaving. Yes, you certainly could color it a flat color if you've never done shading before, but practicing shading is a really interesting way to give much more depth and illusion of 3 dimensions to your drawing. So that's the basics there. And so I'm going to repeat my same steps on the bottom section of my fabric, making it darkest where the shadow would be, where it's going under that strip of fabric that's horizontal. And then I do like to shade a little bit on the ends just to give it kind of a end point, like the ribbon, the fabric, whatever it is, whatever material is being woven kind of ends. So I'm just going to repeat these steps, and you do have to ask yourself, there's a lot of planning. It's like a checkerboard, but more complicated. Which part of the fabric would be going over and which part of the fabric is going under. So it did take me a lot of practice to kind of get to this point, and that is why I'm keeping my color scheme simple, and I'm limiting how many pieces or strips of fabric I'm going to be shading. At this point, I know for a fact that this piece of fabric is underneath the red one, so I'm going to start shading with black. I think black and red with a white background makes a really nice simple color scheme, so I'm going to stick with that. And again, I'm putting my darkest value, getting as dark as I can next to where it overlaps with the red on both sides. So you can see me kind of hesitate here. Always stop and ask yourself, okay, wait, just like a checkerboard, what area would be black and what would be red, but also what would be over and what would be under. I think it'd be easier to weave than it actually is to draw a picture of a weaving, but maybe that's just me. I think it's easiest to mark those sections before you really get into the shading so you can just focus on one thing at a time. So what I'm doing now is marking with my black. Okay, what area am I going to color black on top of the red? And I'm marking it just like I would with a checkerboard pattern. So that section's going to be red, and do it really lightly because that is your lightest section. So you can see I put a red dot where the red would be on top of the black, and then a black dot on where the black will be on top of the red. If this confuses you, look at pictures of weavings. I have this lawn chair in my backyard, one of those retro aluminum lawn chairs with the, I don't even know what material it is, but it's always like a plaid. So this is kind of like a plaid pattern. And my one regret here is that I put my mark in the center, and I would have preferred to keep that really light or white. So I would say if you're doing that, mark kind of where the shadow would be of where it crosses. That's just kind of what I learned. You can see I'm trying to erase it because I'm realizing like, ugh, but I make it work. Now that I have more confidence, I'm going to speed things up a little bit because you've seen me shade all of the red, and I'm going to do the same technique with the black. You can see me adding a line here, so I remembered this needs to be really dark because it's coming out from underneath the red piece of fabric. And you can see it's a really dark gray right next to it. And then try and leave not perfectly white, but like a light gray area where it covers. Now here's my mistake. I put a shadow on the other side, and that's actually should be the raised up area. So I do learn from my mistakes. You can see me trying to blend it. I only do that once with this drawing, and I do kind of go back and try and make it work. Making art is all about learning. If you can do everything perfectly the first time, you must be a robot, or you maybe you're Einstein. But even him, Einstein always talks about how there's this quote that I see up at school that it's not that I'm so much smarter than everyone else, I stick with problems longer. I think that's a really great quote. So instead of giving up because you make a mistake, stick with it longer. If this is hard for your brain, if seeing things like patterns visually or thinking logically, if that's hard for you, then exercises like this is a really great way to stretch your brain and really challenge yourself for a style of art that's a little more pattern and logical based. So continuing the pattern of under, over, under, the black section is over the red, which means in the next section, the red is going to be over the black. So you can see I've laid in my values. I do have that little awkward spot up at the top, but you know, I'm not going to stress about it. Now I'm going to go back to red, and I did rotate my paper. And muscle memory is a really important part of drawing. So it's not like you can't move your paper around to fit your what makes your hand comfortable. So for some reason, shading vertically really made sense to my brain today. So when I shade my stripes, I kind of flip my paper so I'm going up and down instead of side to side. So I'm going to repeat these steps. I'm taking my red and I'm pressing down as hard as I can because it's coming out from underneath the black. Then I'm applying my second value, which needs to be about like a dark to medium red. I do that on both sides. You can see I'm leaving a gap of white in the middle. That's not going to stay white. That's going to be my lightest red. So I think 3 values is a good goal here. Dark, medium, and lightest in the middle. And you're going to keep repeating these steps for all of your weaving interactions. Because this weaving is fabric or ribbon or whatever paper, whatever it is that you would weave, I am trying to do smooth shading. So you can see I'm overlapping. You don't want it to jump straight from one value to the next. You want it to look like a pretty smooth progression for this. And so I'm going to take my time to kind of overlap and perfect my shading before moving on to the next area. If you're thinking, wow, she's really drawing this quickly, I just sped this up to twice the speed that you saw me do originally because I have shaded 2 red ribbons now. I'm moving on to my black. And so I'm picking up my pace because this is a lot of repetition, doing the same thing over and over again, which is such a great way to practice and to learn. So I'm feeling more confident. I kind of have an understanding of my pattern, where the red will be, where the black will be. Because of my mistake, I understand like where I should be shading and where I should be keeping it light. So it's all about repeating just those areas of shading. This is a good example. Do you see my little circle in the white area, how it's standing out? that's a good example as to why you should draw it somewhere else or why you should draw it lighter, because this is the area that should have the highlight or the lightest area of gray or whatever color you are using. So it looks like it's sitting up, it's raised up because it's on top of another piece of fabric. So this is a great example of what that value should look like. If I had to critique myself, which I'm very good at finding what I would like to do differently in art, I feel like my ribbon sizes are kind of random. That was on purpose. I wanted them to be organic and kind of flowy, but some of them are a little thick and then awkwardly thin in others. So my advice would be, if I were to do this again, or if you're doing it for the first time, be a little bit more consistent in the shape and size of your ribbon. It's not wrong. It certainly could look like this, but I wish it was a little bit tighter and a little bit more precise. So this pattern is going to be where the black is over, under, over. And so you can see how that's different from the first black ribbon that was under, over, under. This is very confusing. So I'm gonna speed things up even more since this is just a repeat of the shading technique. You could stop here with the shading, but when I use color, I can't just stop with one flat color with shading. I always include blending. So depending on your skills as an artist, maybe you just keep it one flat color. Maybe you just focus on shading. I'm gonna speed through the rest of my shading so this video isn't 45 minutes long. And then I'm gonna show you how to blend some color to your already shaded areas to really make this work of art pop. I think this is a great exercise because of the repetition. Get in the rhythm of shading. You're repeating, you're practicing, and it's a great way to build those foundational skills to get better at drawing and making things look three-dimensional when you're using colored pencils. So just like magic, look how fast I'm working. I'm almost done with my shading, and I love this area I just finished because my values are so clear. Now that I have my color mapped out, I'm gonna blend some colors that are similar to the color scheme. So as you can see, I'm applying orange, and this is going to be in real time. So I'm going as fast as I went in real life. And you can see how it just gives that orange or that red a little bit more warmth, and it just gives it a little bit more of a nuance of color. So anytime I use color, I don't, especially with colored pencils and oil pastels, things like that, I always blend. It's easy to control, and just a little extra effort just takes your artwork to the next level. So if your main focus with this is just the shading, you could stop and not do this step, but I always encourage push ahead and see what would happen if you blended at least one color. So I have my orange, and then I'm taking white and blending on top just to give it a smooth texture. A white colored pencil is great for blending. It doesn't make the color all that lighter like an oil pastel would, but it blends. And then I'm using a really dark blue to give it a shadow. So remember how we made it as dark red as possible next to the overlapping black. To make it even darker, choose a color like blue. You could use black if you wanted, or green, which is the complement of red. Oops, broke my colored pencil there. And then just go back and really enhance that shadow by adding just a light bit of blue on top of the red. So you can see that it's still a red ribbon or a red piece of fabric, but that small enhancement of using the orange, the white, and the blue gives it so much more depth of color and makes it so much more interesting. Anytime I'm blending with colored pencils, I always go back to the base color, and for this it's red, just to make sure that that is the dominant color. Everything is really smooth, and it just looks like it's all a part of the same piece of fabric, all part of the same shape. So I'm just taking my red and making sure that my shading is good and everything blends together. Speaking of shading, notice that I did shading. It's like I still press down hard like you see me doing here. Hardest next to the red, a little lighter after that, and then really light or almost non-existent in the middle. So because this is, you don't want the ribbon to be orange, or maybe you do, that's totally fine. If you want it more orange, press down harder, and if you want it less orange and more red, then always kind of keep it at a lighter value. So I'm just gonna repeat my steps here, so I'm gonna speed things up. You've seen me do this once before. I'm just sticking with the same color schemes, orange, white in the middle, and then a blue shadow. I always forget how time-consuming blending with colored pencils and shading with colored pencils can be. Because it's such like a fine point, to take up a big space and really shade and blend, it does take a lot of effort and work. But to make good art, to make something look truly like you put effort into it, artwork, right? It does take time, but the effort always pays off. So you can see me kind of going back and touching up. Now moving on to the black, I'm going to use a light blue. So the light blue is going to serve just like the orange did with the red. I still want this to look black, so I want the gray areas to look gray. And I thought this light blue would give it a little more depth of color, kind of brighten it up a little bit, cool things down, not let it just be flat, but also really match the color scheme. So I'm going to be using the light blue, very similar to what you saw me do with the orange. I'm going to use the white to kind of blend all of that together. You can see it's light and it just kind of makes the texture smooth. And I'm going to repeat these steps with each of them. Because I don't want to overly complicate things, I could definitely get that dark blue and do a shadow similar to what I did with the red. But because black is the darkest of colors, and I do really have a nice light gray area, I'm gonna not over blend. I really could stay here and blend every single color into all of these stripes, and I'm just gonna work with what I have. As I repeat these same steps, I'm going to speed things up a little bit. And you can see I'm just repeating, keeping that darkest area where the ribbon overlaps and then maintaining a lighter value where the ribbon would be going over. So since I'm using black, I'm going to try and press down as hard as I can to get a really nice black shadow. And I'm also going to really pay attention to the edges and just try and make sure I erase any like stray lines. And I feel like I've done all the shading and blending that I can do. The shape of the ribbon I've already critiqued, but it is what it is. Thank you so much for sticking around and making art with me. And if you're interested in more art tutorials, check these out. Also check out my website, thatartteacher.com, for full-length lesson plans and my Instagram account @thatartteacher_Machado to see what my students are up to in my classroom.